My son came through the kitchen door on the Saturday before Thanksgiving with a manila envelope tucked under his arm and a grin I hadn't seen on him since the day he closed on his house. "Dad, hey. 20 minutes tops. Then we can catch the second half." Then he saw the woman sitting at the far end of my table, reading glasses pushed up into her gray hair, a legal pad in front of her, and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. He stopped like he'd walked into a pane of glass he didn't know was there. The grin stayed on his face a second too long, the way a light bulb glows for a moment after you've cut the power. The envelope came halfway up and stopped. Behind him, a man in a navy quarter-zip stood holding a small case with a notary stamp inside it, hourly rate already running. My son, 44 years old. A man who talks for a living. A man who has stood in front of rooms full of retirees and bond ladders, without so much as glancing at a note. And in my kitchen that morning he could not produce one word. 8 months before that, I used to sit out on the porch on Sunday evenings with my phone face up on my knee, not doing anything with it, just having it there. In case. I'd have given up most of what I owned to get him to drive the 19 miles out and eat a sandwich with me. Now he was standing on my linoleum with a notary and a folder, and I wanted him gone. Because there's a thing that's worse than a son who never comes around. It's the son who finally does. And while he's got his arms around you, you can hear him adding, "My name's Vernon Kessler. I'm 71 years old. I live outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a house I bought in 1983 when the interest rate would have made you sit down. 3 bedrooms, brick, a carport that leans about 2 degrees and always has. I hauled freight for 46 years. Started as a company driver at 23, sitting in the sleeper of a truck that smelled like somebody else's cigarettes. Eating gas station burritos on the Will Rogers Turnpike at 3 in the morning. Bought my own tractor at 31. A 1979 Peterbilt 359, red mostly. Financed by a man at a bank in Sand Springs who shouldn't have done it and knew it. 20 years later I had 9 trucks, a yard out toward Catoosa, and 11 drivers who called me when their transmission went out and when their marriages did too. Kessler Freight. It was never on a billboard. It was on the doors of 9 trucks and on a sign nobody could read from the highway. When I sold the company in 2019, I did it quiet. Sold to a regional outfit that kept every driver and every route. I signed the paperwork in a conference room in Broken Arrow and then went out to my truck and sat there for 20 minutes with the key in my hand, not turning it. That's the thing nobody tells you about selling something you built. You don't feel rich, you feel unemployed. After that my days shrank down into something small and good. Coffee on the back step. The redbird that fought his own reflection in my storm door every spring and lost every spring. Wednesdays I drove out to a diner on Old Route 66 in Catoosa, where a man named Dewey Pruitt has been burning the bottom of the same pot of coffee since the Carter administration. I drove a 2011 Silverado with a cracked bumper and 214,000 miles on it. Everybody kept telling me to get something new, but it started. Every morning, first turn. That's all I ever asked from a vehicle, a dog, or a man. I never lived like somebody with money, because I never once in my whole life thought of myself as somebody with money. There's men who buy things so strangers will look at them. I never figured out what they wanted the strangers to say. Turns out somebody had been looking a whole lot closer than I knew. My son Grant is 44, financial advisor. Series 7, Series 66, the whole alphabet. He and his wife Sloan live down in Jenks in a house with a stacked stone entryway and a lawn service, and a mailbox that matches every mailbox on that street for a quarter mile. 2 kids. Ren, who's 12 and reads at the table and makes me laugh. Bo, who's 7 and has never once in his life walked when he could run. When Grant was small, we were tight, especially after his mother went. His mom, Marlene, died in the fall of 1994. Ovarian found late, gone in 14 months. Grant was 12. Our daughter Tessa was 9. You want to know what raising 2 kids alone while running trucks looks like? It looks like a man doing dispatch from a payphone in a school parking lot. It looks like a Little League uniform washed in a truck stop sink. It looks like a lot of frozen pizza and a lot of nights where you're not sure you did a single thing right. But Grant and me, we had it. He rode with me on short hauls in the summer, slept in the bunk with his sock feet on my thermos. He was 8 years old in the passenger seat, and he pointed at the key on the ring and said, "When I'm big, I'm driving this one." That first key, the Peterbilt. It's been hanging on a nail by my back door for 40 years, and then somewhere along the line it changed. Not on a specific day. Nothing you could circle on a calendar. Just where. The way a driveway cracks. You look up one year and it's a different driveway. The calls got shorter, then they got scheduled, then they got skipped. Birthdays turned into a text with a cake emoji at 9:40 at night, which is when a man remembers he's got a father. I blamed the world for it. People are busy. I was busy once, I understood, but then came the questions. He'd call, out of nowhere, no reason, and ask me things that didn't sound like him. Dad, is the roof holding up? That's original, right? What's a roof run these days? You still doing your own taxes? Really? Dad, you ever think about downsizing? Something on one level? Small things, reasonable things. A man asking after his father. Then one night in February, he called during the Thunder game, and after about 4 minutes of nothing, he said, real casual, "Hey, out of curiosity, who's on your accounts? Like, is anybody a joint owner? Or is it just you?" I laughed at him. Who else would it be? No, yeah, totally. Just, planning. Then he changed the subject to the bullpen. I didn't think about it again for 6 weeks. I've thought about it maybe 400 times since. I want to stop right here. Because if you've ever had somebody you love start asking you things that land just a little crooked, questions dressed up in a coat of concern, but you can feel the shape of what's underneath, then you know the feeling I'm talking about. It's not fear. It's more like a draft coming in from a door you thought was shut. And the thing you do, if you're anything like me, is tell yourself you're being paranoid. Because who wants to be the kind of man who's suspicious of his own boy? Who wants to be that? So you push it down. I pushed it down for the better part of a year. The thing that finally got through to me came on an ordinary Wednesday in early spring at Dewey's Diner in Tulsa. Dewey Pruitt is 78 and has opinions about everything, including things he's never seen. That morning he was quieter than usual. He refilled me twice without saying anything, which for Dewey is practically a medical emergency. Finally he leaned on the counter with both hands. "Vern, I gotta ask you a thing, and I want it to be nothing." "Okay, you feeling all right?" "Up here." And he tapped the side of his own head with 2 fingers. I set the cup down. Far as I know, he wouldn't look at me. "Your boy was in here about 3 weeks ago with some fella. He was telling him you've been having trouble, forgetting things, getting turned around driving, missing bills." The heater over the door kicked on. I remember that. I remember the little rattle it makes. I said, "Dewey, he said that?" "He said it in that booth right there," Dewey said. I wasn't listening on purpose, but I heard the word confused, about you. Here's the part I've never been able to explain right, that didn't make me mad. Anger is a hot thing and this wasn't hot. What it did was make the floor tilt. Because there's a specific kind of betrayal that comes from somebody using your own mind against you. They're not just telling a lie about what you did. They're telling a lie about what you are. They're trying to erase you while you're still standing there breathing. And if that's ever happened to you, if somebody's ever rewritten who you are to get something out of you, you already know the ugly secret of it. It doesn't make you angry first. First, it makes you doubt yourself. I sat in Dewey's parking lot for a good while. Then I did something I'm not proud of. I drove home the long way, past the old yard, and at every turn, I quizzed myself. Street name. Year I bought the truck. My own social security number. Marlene's birthday. I got every one of them. And I still cried a little at a stoplight in Owasso, because a man shouldn't have to prove to himself that he exists. A week later, my son called me and he was sweet as pie. Warmer than he'd been in 3 years. Asked about my knees, asked about the red bird, asked if I'd been sleeping. Then he floated it, real easy. He'd like to come by, get some paperwork squared away. Just the basic stuff everybody ought to have in place. And he'd bring somebody who could notarize it right there at the table, so I wouldn't have to go anywhere. It's just being responsible, Dad. God forbid something happens and we're scrambling. I said that sounded fine. Then I hung up and stood in my kitchen with my hands still on the phone for a long time. That night I sat at my table and looked at the picture stuck to the freezer door with a magnet from a tire shop that closed in 2003. Marlene, Grant, Tessa, me. Grand Lake, summer of '92. Grant's got a sunburn shaped like a tank top and he's holding up a stringer of crappie like he's just landed a marlin. And I sat there and let myself think the thought I'd been shoving down all year. I wondered whether my son still saw me as his father, or as a balance. I hated myself for thinking it. I want to be straight with you about that. It felt like a filthy thing to think about a boy whose fevers I'd sat up with. Then I called Esther. Let me tell you exactly who Esther Lang is, because my son later told people a version of it that never had a word of truth in it. Esther ran dispatch in the office at Kessler Freight for 22 years. She is 69 years old, 5'1", and she has never in her life lost an argument with a driver. When Marlene was dying, Esther did payroll. She kept the trucks moving. She showed up at my house with a casserole dish and stood in the doorway with her arms crossed until I ate some of it in front of her. She was not my girlfriend. She was never going to be my girlfriend. She was the person who knew where everything was. But a 12-year-old boy watched a woman who wasn't his mother in his mother's kitchen, and he decided something about it. Kids do that, and nothing I ever said scrubbed it out. It just sat there in him like a rust stain. When Esther retired to Bentonville to be near her sister, I think Grant felt lighter. I figured 20-odd years would sand that down. I figured wrong. He never once said her name to me, without the temperature dropping. I hadn't talked to her much. Christmas card. Call on her birthday. But that night I called her, and we were on the phone for 2 hours and 10 minutes. I mostly wanted somebody who'd known me at my sharpest to tell me if I was slipping. Not the way Grant meant it. The other way. The way where you stop trusting your own read on people. At the end of it she said, "I'm coming down." I told her not to. She said, "Vernon, I'm not coming because I think he's doing something. I'm coming because you deserve to know which it is." She was in my driveway 11 days later. She spread 46 years of my life across my dining room table. Bank statements, the trust nobody had ever set up, the sale documents from 2019, my IRA, the annuity, the deed. She organized it in about 4 hours, which is about 3.5 hours less than it would have taken me. Then she started asking questions I hadn't thought to ask, not about money, about access. Who had a copy of what? Who had been asking questions of who? Who had suddenly gotten so curious about an old trucker's checking account? It came together fast, and none of it came from snooping. That's the part people don't believe. It came from the way things travel in a place like this. Dewey mentioned Grant had been in twice, always with the same man, always with a legal pad. A driver I used to run, retired now, lives out in Bixby, said he'd bumped into Grant at a Thunder game, and Grant had made a joke about crypto that hadn't sounded like a joke. Then Esther's sister's neighbor, of all people, who works closings for a title company, mentioned that a young couple had been asking around about my street. What houses go for, how fast a brick ranch moves. Nothing illegal in any of it. Not one thing. A margin call. A HELOC he'd pulled against a house that was already stretched. An investment that went sideways and then went underneath. 2 vacations financed at 24%. A boat, God help me. The kind of hole a man digs quietly, out of pride, until the sides start to come in, and I still didn't want to hook it to me. I kept looking for another door out of the room. Then Esther found the thing. It was a Tuesday afternoon. She was going through a stack of mail I'd been meaning to deal with for a month, and she went completely still, which she never does. "Vernon," she said, and I did not like her voice. She slid a sheet across to me. It was a notice from my bank. Routine on the face of it. A confirmation that someone had contacted them, requesting information about the process by which a third party could be granted authority over the accounts of an account holder deemed unable to manage his affairs. No name on the form. Nothing signed. Nothing done. Just questions. Asked 11 days before my son called me sweet as pie. I sat there a long while. Esther didn't fill the silence. She never does. That's one of about 900 reasons I trust her. Finally I said, "Maybe he's just getting out ahead of things." She looked at me with so much sorrow in her face that it took the wind out of me. "Vernon," she said, "do you actually believe that?" I didn't, but Lord, I wanted to, because the other version of it was more than I could pick up right then. I barely slept that night. I lay there and ran every phone call back through my head. Every question. Every burst of interest in my roof and my knees and my joint accounts. And the pattern I'd spent a year refusing to look at stood up in the dark and turned the light on. My son was not preparing to take care of me. He was preparing to take over. I'll be honest with you. If that were your kid, I don't know how you'd have slept either. The papers came in October, 4 weeks before Thanksgiving, delivered by my own son over a plate of donuts. And the first thing that scared me about them was how good they looked. They weren't some scheme scratched out on a napkin. Clean typeface. Tabbed. Little red arrow stickers pointing at every place my signature went. Prepared by an attorney out of Oklahoma City named Wexler. A durable power of attorney. A healthcare proxy. And a third document further back that Grant did not mention while he was pointing at the arrows. He left them so I could look them over, which is a phrase that assumes you won't. The next morning Esther and I sat down at 7 o'clock and read every page out loud. The house was dead quiet except for the fridge and the sound of her pen. She was always like that. Back in the business she could find a billing error from across the room. I'd swear an invoice was clean and she'd lay one finger on a line and say, "That right there is going to cost you $900, and it always did. She read the middle document twice. Then she circled something and looked up over her glasses. "This is not the standard form. How's it different?" "It's effective immediately," she said. "Not on incapacity. The second you sign it, he can move money. He doesn't have to prove anything to anybody." Then she got to the third document, the one behind the last tab. It was a draft, not filed. A petition to the District Court of Tulsa County, and it had my name on it, and it used a phrase I have not been able to get out of my head since. Respondent is a partially incapacitated person unable to manage his financial resources. There was a blank for a physician's evaluation, and penciled in the corner, in my son's handwriting, his handwriting which I taught him, sitting at that same table, a date. 2 weeks out. He hadn't found a doctor yet. That's what the appointment was. That's what the checkup he'd been nagging me about since August was. He needed a signature from somebody with an MD, after their name saying I was slipping, and then he needed mine on the power of attorney, and if he got the first, he didn't strictly need the second. Esther set her pen down. She looked out the window for a while. Then she said, "Call Malcolm. Malcolm Reyes is an elder law attorney in Tulsa. 62, wears a bolo tie without irony. He came out to my house on a Thursday and sat in my kitchen for 3 hours and asked kiskinches and let me talk. And then he told me some things that I think every single person listening to this ought to hear, because I didn't know them, and I ran a business for 30 years. He said, first, a power of attorney is not a small piece of paper. It is a set of keys to your entire life, and most people hand them over because a relative told them it was routine. He said, there is a difference between springing and immediate, and nobody explains it to you, and that difference is everything. He said, your healthcare proxy does not have to be your child. Mine names my physician's practice and a friend, and no relative of mine can override it. And he said the thing I've thought about most. He said, an irrevocable trust isn't a trick, Mr. Kessler. It's not hiding anything. It just means the thing is no longer mine to be taken from me. It stops being a prize somebody can win. Then he called Wexler, the attorney in Oklahoma City. Put him on speaker. I sat there with my arms crossed, trying not to feel like a fool at my own table. Wexler was cautious, polite. Malcolm asked him, plain, what he'd been told about my condition. There was a pause on the line. My client expressed concerns about his father's cognitive decline, memory issues, difficulty with bills, susceptibility to influence from a non-family caregiver. Non-family caregiver. Esther, sitting 8 feet away with a legal pad, went absolutely white and then absolutely calm. Malcolm said, did you ever meet with Mr. Kessler? No, sir. I was told he had already agreed in principle and that timing was a factor. A pause. I did tell my client I would not notarize anything without meeting the principal in person and having a physician's evaluation in hand. That was non-negotiable. I looked down at my hands, 60 pounds of steel and diesel in cold mornings, right there in the knuckles. Not helpless hands, not confused ones. After we hung up, Malcolm sat quiet a minute and then said, he's not the villain here. I know it, I said, and I did. He'd been handed a story and no reason to disbelieve it. That's how it works. That's how it always works. Knowing it didn't make it weigh any less. I kept the doctor's appointment. That surprised Grant, I think. He offered to drive me. I told him I could find Tulsa. Her name was Dr. Priya Raman and she was maybe 38 and she did not rush. She'd gotten a message from my son. She said so, right up front. She said she'd read it and then she'd set it aside. Because, and I'm quoting her, I don't diagnose people through their relatives. Then she put me through it, 2 hours, drew a clock. Repeat these 5 words. Now the 5 words again. Count backward by 7s from 100. Which I want you to try sometime if you think you're sharp. At the end she looked at the paper and then at me. 29 out of 30, she said. You missed 1 word. So did I when we trained on this. I said something I'm embarrassed by. I said, you sure? And she put her pen down and looked me dead in the eye and said, Mr. Kessler, there is nothing wrong with your mind. I want you to hear that from a doctor out loud in a room, because I suspect you've been hearing something else. I got out to my truck and I sat there with my hands on the wheel and I shook. Not from relief. From the year, the whole year of it, coming up out of me at once in a parking garage on Utica Avenue. For the next few weeks, I carried the whole thing around in me like a rock in my boot. I'd be brushing my teeth and hear my son's voice describing me to a stranger as confused. I'd be pushing a cart through the Riazers on 71st and remember him asking who was on my accounts. I'd drive past the old yard out on the highway and my chest would go tight as a strap. And here's the crazy part. I still wanted to defend him. I built excuses the way I used to build load plans. Maybe Sloan pushed him. Maybe he really was scared. Maybe he saw me hunt for my glasses one time and it spooked him. Maybe it started out as worry and just went bad in the dark the way meat does. That's what we do, I guess. We keep hunting around for the good version of our kids even when the evidence is sitting right there in a tabbed folder. One night in early November I couldn't sleep at all. Got up at 3, made coffee I didn't want, and stood at the sink drinking it in the dark like some sad divorced man in a beer commercial. The porch light caught the key on the nail. That first key, the Peterbilt. I stood there and I thought about my boy at 8 years old in the passenger seat with his sock feet on my thermos, pointing at that key. And I want you to sit with what I thought next, because it's the truest thing in this whole story. I thought about signing everything, all of it, just to make it stop, just to have him in my kitchen again on a Sunday, even if he only came for the money, because at least he'd be in my kitchen. If you've ever loved somebody who was hurting you, you know that voice. The one that says, if I just give them what they want, I get to keep them. That voice is a liar. But at 3 in the morning, brother, is it ever convincing? The next day Esther came over with a folder of her own and a face like she hadn't slept either. Not sleepy tired. The other kind. The kind that comes from learning something true you'd have paid money not to know. She laid out 2 emails. Nothing she got illegally. A woman she knew from the title company had simply been asked a question and thought it was strange. Grant and Sloane had been asking what my house would appraise for, and how quickly a place like mine would move if it were vacant. Vacant. They called it planning ahead. That phrase again. Everybody's got a nice phrase. I sat and stared at those 2 pages. My house is not much, but it's mine. Marlene picked the paper in the hall, and I never had the heart to take it down even after it went out of style twice. I laid the deck myself, 1 board at a time, in August, and I have the scar on my thumb to prove it. There's a mark on the pantry door frame for every year of Grant's height and every year of Tessa's, going up and then just stopping. And if you're a parent, you know exactly why those marks stop. And my son had been out there talking about the square footage. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I sat there. After a long while, Esther said, "I'm sorry, Vernon." And that was the exact moment the guilt started coming off me. Not all of it. Enough to stand up under. I still loved him. That part never budged an inch, and it hasn't since. But loving somebody doesn't mean you hold still while they measure the floor you're standing on. For a whole year I'd been asking myself whether my son would hurt me. That afternoon I finally asked the right question, which was, how far is he willing to go? By the middle of November I'd made up my mind. Not just about the papers, about all of it, the house, the money, what was left of my life and who it belonged to. But I didn't want a screaming match. I've been in enough of those to know nobody remembers what was said, only how loud it was. And then everybody spends 4 years arguing about the volume. I wanted it out in the open, in daylight, in front of people, where it couldn't get rewritten later into a story about a confused old man. So I did Thanksgiving. I'd hosted it for 31 years, and it never occurred to anybody to think twice about the invitation. 22 people, Grant and Sloane and the kids. Tessa, my daughter, who's a hospice nurse in Broken Arrow and who I had not told a single thing to, because she has enough dying people in her week without me adding to it. 2 of my old drivers and their wives. My neighbor Chet Dunlap, Esther, and 1 more. But I'll get there. Grant and Sloane said yes inside of an hour, and that right there told me everything I needed to know. They still thought I was going to sign. Thanksgiving came in cold and bright, 38 degrees and not a cloud. One of those Oklahoma days where the sky is so big and empty it makes you feel watched. I had the bird in by 7. Tessa showed up at 10 and immediately started reorganizing my refrigerator, which is her way of saying she loves me. Chet Dunlap spent 25 uninterrupted minutes explaining to 2 people who had not asked why his St. Augustine outperforms everybody else's on the block. By noon the house smelled like sage and my kitchen was so full of people I had to turn sideways to get to the oven. For a couple hours it was almost normal, almost. But I could feel it sitting up under my breastbone the whole time, cold and patient. Grant and Sloane came at 1. He shook my hand. He always shakes my hand now. Sloane hugged me the way you hug a mailbox, and then her eyes started moving. Around the living room, down the hall, looking, checking. I saw it. I didn't say a thing. When Esther walked in the front door, Sloane's smile pulled tight at the corners for about a quarter of a second. Most people wouldn't have caught it. I caught it. At 2:40, a young man came up the driveway in a Corolla with a Coast Guard sticker on the back glass. He was 27 years old, 6'2", wearing a tie he clearly did not own. His name is Isaiah Boone. Grant looked at him and then at me with a question on his face, and I said, "Friend of mine," and I didn't say anything else. We ate at 4. 22 of us at 2 tables shoved end to end, with the good tablecloth over the seam where they don't match. Bo knocked over a glass of milk within 11 minutes, which is a family record. I want to tell you that I enjoyed the food. I have no memory of the food. Around 5:15, when the pie was out, and the plates were pushed back and everybody was in that loose, unbuttoned state, I stood up and tapped a fork on the side of my water glass. Nothing dramatic. Just enough. The talking rolled down to nothing. Every head turned. I thanked them for coming. I said something about Marlene and how she'd have hated my gravy, and a few people laughed the way you do. Then I looked straight at my son, Grant. Esther and I have spent the last several months getting my affairs in order. I watched him go rigid. Sloane's hand stopped moving on her napkin, and I learned a few things while we were doing it. The room went so quiet I could hear the ice maker. Nobody knew where this was headed. I'm not sure Grant did either. I didn't raise my voice. I never once raised my voice. I just laid it down piece by piece, the way you'd stack brick. That an old friend told me my son had been telling people around Tulsa that I was losing my memory. Heads turned. That documents had been prepared for me to sign by an attorney, who had never met me, who had been told I'd already agreed. That somebody had called my bank in February to ask how a person might get authority over an account holder's money. No tears, no theatrics. Facts set down one after the other and let them sit there. And I watched it move through that room. Confusion first, then something uncomfortable, then something colder. Grant cut in. "Dad, that's not fair." I looked at him, calm as I have ever been in my life. Which part isn't? He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and nothing came out, because facts are hard to argue with when 19 people are watching you do it. Then I did the one thing I'd planned. I reached down beside my chair and brought up the folder, and I opened it to the third tab, and I read one sentence out loud. Respondent is a partially incapacitated person, unable to manage his financial resources. I set it down. I said, "That's a court filing. My name's on it." It's got a date penciled in his handwriting. Tessa put her hand over her mouth. And then Sloane Kessler made the mistake. The kind people make when they're cornered and scared and the thing they've been holding in their teeth for a year comes flying out before the brain can grab it. She threw up both hands and said, "Oh, come on, Vernon. And who exactly is supposed to pay for memory care? Us?" Nobody moved. I mean nobody. Chet Dunlap stopped chewing mid-bite. A woman near the window slowly turned and studied my curtains. Wren, 12 years old, looked at her mother and then at her father, and something happened in that child's face I will regret for the rest of my days. Because Sloane had just said the loud part. Not inheritance. Worse, memory care. She'd said the plan out loud. She'd said what I was to them. A bill they were budgeting for, and a house they were budgeting from. Her face went the color of dishwater about a half second after she heard herself. Too late. You can't put that back in. I let it hang there. I wanted every person under my roof to sit in it. Then I said, "Well, funny you should bring that up." Grant looked like he wanted the floor to open. "I sold the house," I said. "You could feel it land." Grant blinked. "You what?" "In September. Closed the 18th. Young couple, 2 little kids, she's a nurse. I've got a rent back through the end of March, and then I'm gone." Sloane said, "That's not, Vernon, that's not possible. She stopped herself. But everybody heard the shape of the rest of that sentence. "And this past spring," I said, "I moved just about everything I own into an irrevocable trust." Grant's face went white, the exact same white it went the Saturday he walked in with his envelope and saw Esther at my table, and then I gave them the part nobody had coming. "Before either one of you says it out loud," I said, "Esther Lang is not getting a dime of it." 22 heads turned. Esther, God love her, looked mildly entertained. "She's the trustee. She's paid a fee, and it's a small one, and she fought me about taking it. That's the whole thing. That's all it ever was, and if you'd ever asked me a question instead of building a story, you'd have known that 20 years ago." Esther set down her coffee. She looked down the length of that table at my son, and she said the only thing she said all evening. "I changed your diapers, Grant." Nobody breathed. "I sat up with you when you had the chicken pox because your daddy had a load in Little Rock and your mama was in the hospital. I know exactly who you are." She took her glasses off. "And this isn't him." He couldn't hold her eyes. 44 years old, and he looked at his plate. Sloane said, "Then who gets it?" And the greed came off that question like heat off a road, so I gave them the last piece. "Most of it," I said, "funds a scholarship. Commercial driver's license training at Tulsa Tech. For veterans. Every year for as long as the money holds, which Malcolm tells me is a good long while." I put my hand on the back of the chair to my right. "It's called the Boone Fund." And down the table, Isaiah Boone stood up. Tie he didn't own, hands shaking a little. Most of the people in that room didn't know the name. My old drivers did. I saw one of them put his hand over his eyes. Cliff Boone drove for me for 9 years. On January the 11th, 2005, I dispatched him on a reefer load to Springfield in weather I should have shut down for. He hit black ice on the Will Rogers Turnpike near Veneta at 4:40 in the morning, and he died in the median, and he was 34 years old. I have thought about that morning every single week for 19 years. Every week. Ask Esther. Isaiah was 6. I paid for the funeral, and I sent a check at Christmas for 11 years, and then his mother wrote and asked me to stop, kindly, because it was time, and she was right, and I stopped. He did 2 tours as a combat medic. He came home and he wanted his Class A, and he couldn't put together the tuition. "He's the first one," I said. "There'll be one every year after." The furnace kicked on. Somewhere out on the highway a Jake brake went off, that long tearing sound, and I have loved that sound my whole life. And I want to tell you the truth, what I felt right then was light. Not victorious. Light. Like setting down a load I'd been carrying by hand across a parking lot for a year. Grant said very quietly, "Why would you do that?" And the answer came up easier than I expected. "Because a man in Sand Springs gave me a loan he shouldn't have," I said. "That's the whole reason there was ever anything for you to want. I let that sit, and because my life was never an asset for you to manage." He looked away. His eyes went red at the rims. For a second I thought he might fight it, might say something, might defend himself. Instead he stood up. Sloane stood with him. They got the kids' coats. Bo asked where they were going and nobody answered him. Wren stopped at the doorway, 12 years old. She looked back at me and she said, "Bye, Grandpa," and she hugged me hard for about 4 seconds and then she was gone. They didn't look at anybody else, not one person in that room. I heard 2 car doors. then the engine, then nothing. Nobody stopped them. I stood in my dining room with pie on the table and my dead wife's tablecloth under my hands, and I breathed. Now, here's the part I'm not going to lie to you about, because there's plenty of stories out there that lie about this part. The next morning I woke up before light, the way I've done for 50 years, and for maybe 6 seconds everything was fine. Then I remembered. The folder. Sloane's mouth. My son walking across the yard without looking back. And I lay there in the dark and I waited to feel like I'd won. I never did feel it, not once. Not that day or any day after. That's the thing nobody warns you about. Standing up for yourself is right. And losing a piece of your family is grief. And both of those things will live in the same chest at the same time, and neither one of them gives an inch to the other. Tessa stayed and did dishes with me for 2 hours. She didn't say much. Then, drying her hands, she said something I've thought about ever since. You know what gets me, Dad? He didn't want you sick. She folded the towel. He needed you sick. There's a difference, and it's the worst difference there is. She's a hospice nurse. She's watched 100 families in the worst hour of their lives. When she says a thing like that, I listen. In March I moved. Little 2-bedroom on a rise outside Claremore, 1,200 square feet, a concrete patio, a Bradford pear that's ugly 11 months a year. At night from the patio you can see the lights on the turnpike. That was the whole reason I took it. Packing the old house about did me in. Things kept coming out from behind boxes. The hall where the kids raced. The table where Grant did algebra and cried about it. That pantry door frame. I stood in front of those pencil marks a lot longer than I'd admit to anybody. Then I shut the door. Some chapters have earned your respect. They still have to end. The first weeks in the new place were quiet in a way I wasn't used to. I bought a decent chair. I started going to a men's breakfast on Tuesdays at a church I don't attend, which they don't seem to mind. And on Thursdays I started going out to Tulsa Tech. Nobody asked me to. I just showed up the first time to see the truck they train on, and the instructor put me to work, and now I'm out there every week. Those kids remind me of the young guys I used to hire. Some cocky, some flat lost. Most of them just needing one person to act like they might amount to something. Isaiah got his Class A in May, passed the road test on the first go, which almost nobody does. When he came out of the cab he was grinning so wide it looked painful. I went home that night and took the key off the nail by the door. The Peterbilt key. It's been dead weight for 30 years. It doesn't open a thing that exists anymore. I gave it to him anyway. Told him what it was. He didn't say anything for a minute. Then he put it on his ring next to his apartment key and he said, "I'll carry it." Driving back to Claremore that evening it caught up with me. For a whole year I'd been so busy defending what I built that I'd forgotten what I built it for. That kid reminded me, and I'll tell you that felt a whole lot better than getting even ever did. Grant didn't call. Not that winter. Not that spring. And I'm not going to dress it up. The silence was worse than the fight. The fight lasted 11 minutes. The silence lasted 7 months. Here's what I've come around to, and I think it's the whole thing this mess had to teach me. People want a clean story. Good guy wins, bad guy loses, the credits roll. Real life won't hold that shape. Grant isn't a cartoon, he's my son. He's the 8-year-old with his feet on my thermos. He's the kid who slept on the floor of my room for a month after his mother died and never once said why. He's the young man who hugged me at his graduation and said, "We did it," and meant it. I can't cut those out. I wouldn't if I could. And this is the part I most want you to hear, especially if you're sitting there tonight with a knot in your gut about somebody in your own family. Most people believe they have to choose. Love them or protect yourself. Keep the family or keep the boundary. Like it's one door or the other and you've got to pick. It isn't. It never was. You can love a person all the way down to the bottom of yourself and still refuse to hand them your life to spend. That's not coldness. That is the only kind of love that survives contact with a real human being. So let me give you one thing you can actually do tonight. That costs nothing. Get a piece of paper. Write down what you've been making excuses for. Not to accuse anybody, not to show anybody, just to quit lying to yourself about a pattern you already see. And then find out 3 things. Whether your power of attorney is springing or immediate, who your healthcare proxy names, and whether the person who'd benefit most from your decline is the same person who's been telling you you're declining. Because you cannot protect yourself from something you won't let yourself look at. And then sit with this question a while. It's the one that finally got me. Am I keeping the peace or am I just avoiding the truth? 7 months after that Thanksgiving, a letter came. Real paper, my son's handwriting on the envelope. I set it on the counter and looked at it for 3 days before I opened it. He didn't ask for anything. That's what got me. Not the trust, not the house, not a dime. 4 paragraphs and he never once used the word money. He wrote, "I stopped seeing you as a person. Somewhere in there you became a spreadsheet with a name on it, and I told myself the whole time that I was just being responsible." He wrote, I have never been so ashamed of anything in my life as I am of what my wife said at your table, except for the fact that she was only saying what I had said to her first. He wrote, I'm not asking you to forgive me, I'm telling you I understand what I did. And at the bottom 4 words. I'm sorry, Dad. I called him 2 weeks later on a Tuesday night. I was halfway through a plate of leftovers watching the radar for storms out toward Pawnee. We were stiff at first. Work, weather, Ren's grades, the way strangers talk. Then he asked if he could bring the kids out sometime and he added fast, just to see you, nothing else. I'll leave Sloan out of it if that's easier. We're in counseling. I said the kids could come whenever they wanted, and they could stay as long as they liked. And there was a creek down the hill Bo would lose his mind over. Then it was quiet on the line for a while. Before we hung up I said the thing I'd been turning over since November. Grant, you never lost your father. He didn't say anything. But my life was never yours to manage. A long breath. Then, I know that now. Nothing got fixed. I want to be clear about that. We are not who we were, and I doubt we'll get there. Trust goes out the door in an afternoon and it comes back in by the teaspoon. But he came out in September with Ren and Bo, and we grilled hot dogs on that ugly little patio, and Bo did in fact lose his mind over the creek. And when they left, Grant stood by his car for a second and looked out at the turnpike lights and he said, You can see the trucks from here. I said, That's why I took it. He nodded and he got in and he drove home. I sat out there a long time after, listening to the 18-wheelers running north with everybody's Christmas in the back, and wondering what Marlene would have made of all of it. She'd have said families are complicated and that real love has to have a fence around it, or the cat'll get out. Something like that. She'd have said it better. I think she'd have been right. Getting old has taught me a lot of things I'd rather not have learned. But here's the biggest one. You can love somebody with your whole heart and still protect yourself from them. And those two things were never enemies. Half the time they're the very same act. The best revenge was never about taking something from my son. It was about refusing to hand over my own dignity just to buy a piece that was already broken. It was about standing there steady enough, long enough, that he finally had to see for himself what he'd let himself turn into. So before I go, I want to hear from you, and I mean that. If you'd been at my table that night, comment a 1 if you think I did right. Comment a 2 if you think I went too far. Comment a 3 if you think I should have taken him out to the driveway and said it to him alone, where nobody else could hear. I read them. Everyone. And tell me where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is where you are right now, because it gets me every time. Thinking about all of us scattered across the map, sitting with some version of the same story. And if you've lived through this, if somebody you loved started looking at you like a line item instead of a person, put it down below. Somebody scrolling past at 2 in the morning might find the nerve they've been needing. If this one meant something to you, subscribe and stick around. I tell these stories because I believe the ones we say out loud make the next person's easier to carry. I'd be glad to have you back for the next one. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Oklahoma to create original content. Any resemblance to actual people or events is coincidental.